The personal reflective essay. So what is a personal reflective essay? Well, a personal reflective essay expresses the writer's personal point of view on a subject drawn from the writer's own experience. While this is narrative in nature, certainly it's a nonfiction essay. This should be based on a real experience. Now, because this is your own real experience, it is certainly appropriate to use personal pronouns like I, me, and my when you are writing this particular essay. In this respect, the personal reflective essay is much more informal than, say, the argumentative research paper. And certainly you're going to be using this personal or first-person point of view as you are writing the essay throughout its duration. Now, keep in mind that the personal reflective essay may grow out of one of life's very big events or big experiences that you've had, such as maybe graduation, or maybe something incredibly unique to you. You got to go on a once-in-a-lifetime trip to a different location. Or maybe you met a famous person. You got to meet the President of the United States, or something of that nature. Maybe you had an event that was somewhat negative. Maybe you experienced a loss or had to combat an illness. And certainly you would have learned something from any of those very big events. But the reality is that maybe the event that you're choosing to write on is something that you might consider to be fairly minor, even though it was a big deal to you personally, such as a camping trip or a rock concert, or certainly a unique drive to a particular location or something of that nature, certainly. There are a number of places where you can look for ideas on which to focus a personal reflective essay in the event you do not have an idea that pops into your head, certainly that you could use as the focus for this piece of writing. Some places where you could look would include things like photo albums. And I'm not necessarily talking about hard copy photo albums, but certainly virtually all of you have a phone at this point in time that has, I'm sure, an archive of anywhere from maybe 50 to a couple hundred to perhaps even 1,000 pictures on it. You could look through those pictures in order to come up with an idea on which to focus this personal reflective essay. You could consult your family, talk to your parents, your siblings, talk to your aunts, uncles, grandparents, and see if there's a family story that maybe they recall that you had forgotten, that involved you, that you could use as the focus again for this essay. You could look through letters, emails, text messages from friends, and so on. Perhaps you had something that happened with a group of friends that you could use as the focus for this essay. If you collect souvenirs from vacations or places to which you've traveled, you could look at those, and perhaps that might spawn an idea or generate a recollection that you could use. School yearbooks, if you tend to write things in your yearbook and have people write things in your yearbook, you could perhaps look in there for ideas on which to focus this essay. Items in your room, and even things like journals, diaries, scrapbooks, and or videos that you may have taken, all could be viable places to look for a topic on which to focus this personal reflective essay. Now, as far as determining the meaning of the experience itself, the goal of this essay is not to just tell me a good story, but really to tell me what you learned from this experience. How did the experience affect you? How did it impact you? How did it make you who and what you are today? That said, again, you want to express this main idea to readers, and this kind of main idea or what you learned from the experience is going to evolve from the meaning or the significance that the experience had for you personally. That said, there might be some questions that you want to ask yourself when you are attempting to interpret your experience, when you're trying to figure out if in fact you did learn something from the experience that you could share certainly toward the end of this essay. Ask yourself, what do you remember most about the experience? And, if it's an experience that happened some time ago, how did the experience affect you at the time? Certainly, you may have had time to process that experience, and while you may have felt one way at the time that it happened, over time you may have realized that your feelings have actually evolved. They've changed. Not only because you've had time to kind of marinate on the experience, but certainly because you are now perhaps older and you have a more mature outlook on the experience and perhaps what it means to you. Once you have a topic certainly in mind, and this topic you have figured out is something you've learned something from, something that's impacted you or affected you in some way, now you need to work on a couple other aspects of pre-writing. You see, while your goal is not to simply tell me a good story, you do need to tell me a good story before you explain to me what you learned from the experience and certainly why you learned what you learned. As a result of that, it's important to develop and select details to kind of help to bring your particular experience to life. You want to choose details that are appropriate for your purpose and audience. Now, I am your audience, obviously, and your purpose is to convey to me that you learned something from this experience. So you want to kind of pull details that certainly are appropriate for a teacher to read, and certainly also kind of lend themselves to the overall purpose. It's incredibly important that you use factual details to provide background information, especially toward the beginning of the essay, when you're attempting to establish the time and the place of the event or occurrence, certainly that you're going to talk about. And perhaps the most important kind of details that you can use throughout your essay are vivid descriptive and sensory details. Don't just rely on your dominant sense. We have a tendency to focus on only our sense of sight because it is the sense that is most often used and certainly is most valuable to us. That said, don't be afraid to include details that, if you will, utilize your sense of smell, taste, touch, sound. You could talk about how you felt physically. You could talk about how you felt emotionally, certainly as this experience. All of these kinds of details will help to give life or breathe life into your story and will result in a much more interesting tale that you're telling that leads up to, again, what you learned from the experience. And keep in mind, you want to consider the events, the people, the places, and the feelings when you're thinking of details as well. As I mentioned, you don't just want to include what you felt physically, but perhaps what you felt emotionally as well when telling this particular story. So we've done the legwork as far as the pre-writing goes. Now we need to get into the actual drafting of the essay. And if you consider the fact that when drafting an essay, you need to include a good introduction, I think this is a great place to start. The first thing you need to do in a good introductory paragraph is you need to grab the reader's attention. You need to suck my eyeballs right out of my head, plaster them to your paper, and make me want to read it. Now, how are you going to do that exactly? Well, there are a couple of different ways that we've discussed prior that you could do this. You could begin with a bit of an anecdote. Sort of a very short story that establishes maybe who you are and what the time and the place were, and so on and so forth of the event that you are going to describe or narrate for me. It might seem a little odd to start a story with another short story, but I assure you it's a very captivating way to grab the attention of your reader. If you don't like the idea, certainly, of starting with an anecdote, you could begin with some sort of an interesting detail that relates to the climactic event of your story. If you remember back to short fiction, we talked about different plot progressions, and one of the plot progressions we talked about was in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle. This is where you read a narrative that starts perhaps at a very important moment in the story, maybe even the climactic event of the story. Then it goes back and fills in the background details, gets up to the climactic event, and then finishes the rest of the story. It certainly isn't a bad idea to use as a formula for writing your personal reflective essay. I had a student a number of years ago that told me the story about a time he went to the beach. And he was climbing on some very large rocks that were at the edge of the beach that were used to kind of keep the sand from eroding, and so on. There were signs clearly stating that he should not climb on the rocks, and he decided to do so anyway, and long story short, he ended up slipping on one of the rocks, falling down, and impaling his leg on a piece of rebar that was used to kind of hold the rocks in place. This young man decided to use this interesting detail to start his personal reflective essay. Essentially, he started it off with, as I looked down, I saw the piece of rebar sticking through my thigh, and at that point I passed out. that was how he began his essay, and it was extremely captivating because I knew nothing else about why the rebar was there, why he passed out. Well, I knew a little bit about why he passed out, but I didn't know all of the background information, so I was captivated. And then he proceeded to tell me the entire story up to that point, and then explain to me the aftermath, having to go to the hospital and have surgery and so on, and certainly then kind of segued into what he learned and why he learned that from that particular experience. But let's say you don't like either one of those things. Well, you could begin with some sort of a startling statement, or with a statement that promises interesting things to follow. While that sounds somewhat similar to the interesting detail, it is, I think, slightly different, but still effective as a means by which to begin your personal reflective essay. Once you have captured the attention of your reader, now you need to provide some necessary background information so that your reader understands the context of what you're about to discuss. It's very important at this point to include the time and the place, and perhaps sprinkle in a few background details here in order to set me up for the more detailed story that you're about to tell me in your body paragraphs. And then, as always, and with any good essay, you need to include a very appropriate thesis statement that really does two things where a personal reflective essay is concerned. Certainly, you want to focus on or include the topic of your essay, essentially what happened, the experience, but you also want to include what you learned from the experience. Now, that might sound a little odd, and some of you are probably sitting there thinking to yourselves, why would I tell you what I learned before I told you the story itself? Well, keep in mind, this is going to be narrative, so you're going to tell me a story, but that's not really the primary focus or goal of this essay. Keep in mind, it is a personal reflective essay. The goal of this essay is really to reflect on the experience, to tell me what you learned and why you learned that. You want to start that process with your thesis statement, where you will include what you learned from the experience. You'll get to the why you learned what you learned certainly in the conclusion paragraph. So you've written your introduction, you have grabbed the reader's attention, you have provided the necessary background information, and you've delivered a thesis statement that includes not only the topic of your essay, but what you learned from the experience. Now you really have 3 body paragraphs to tell your story. The first 2 body paragraphs, or supporting paragraphs, should recount the events that happened, certainly using all the details that we've talked about, background details, especially sensory details, and details that consider certainly the people, the events, and the feelings that you felt at that particular time. By the time you get to your 3rd supporting body paragraph, you should be bringing your story to a close and setting us up for why you learned what you learned from the experience, which will be delivered in your conclusion paragraph. So you've written the introduction, you've now written the body. Now we need to write the conclusion. Your conclusion should start off, as any good conclusion to an essay should, with your restatement of your thesis, which is going to include what you learned from the experience. But now you want to go further. Now you want to provide reflection with explanation that shows why you learned what you learned from this experience. Really, you're going to, again, get into kind of the nuts and bolts of this reflective essay, where you're really going to kind of capstone the story with details about why you felt you learned this particular lesson. And, as with any good essay, it's a good idea to add maybe a striking new detail or a final thought, reflection, or idea that kind of reinforces your perspective or shows how that perspective has changed over time, kind of as the clincher, as the conclusion to your conclusion paragraph in this personal reflective essay. And keep in mind, this is a great place and a great time to appeal to the reader's emotions. Certainly, the entire essay is going to be rather emotional, but you can kind of pluck on the heartstrings of your reader one more time, perhaps in this final reflection, in this final clincher sentence, in your conclusion paragraph, in order to bring your essay to an effective close. So, you've written the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Now you should certainly go through a revision process, in which you really look at the essay as a whole. Is it too short? Is it too general? Is it too vague? Does it focus on a very specific event or a very specific occurrence and include what you learned and why you learned it? Keep in mind, you want to consider, did you employ an effective attention-getting device? Do you have a thesis statement that includes what you learned? Do you have a conclusion paragraph that certainly talks about why you learned what you learned? What's the tone of your essay? If you had a negative experience, does your essay have a more negative or somber kind of diction and syntactical structure? And does that diction or syntactical structure, if it's negative, sort of transition maybe to something more positive if you learned a positive lesson from this negative experience? Certainly it would be appropriate to do so at the end of the essay. Have you used background details? Have you used sensory details to kind of bring the experience itself to life, to help make your story more interesting to the reader? And certainly, as always, you want to proofread your essay for spelling errors, punctuation errors, grammatical errors, etc., to make sure that you are turning in a work that is truly senior-worthy. As always, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Carpe diem, and good night.